one of the White House's top trade advisors, is widely viewed throughout the West Wing and Capitol Hill as a prickly personality with extreme policy ideas. But he has nonetheless emerged as an influential force in the White House who appeals to President Donald Trump's protectionist impulses. Navarro has earned a reputation for stalking the halls of the West Wing at night and on the weekends to find a moment to slip into the Oval Office to privately discuss trade with the president, according to one White House official and a close advisor to the administration. It's his way of maintaining influence through proximity. His clout, dating back to the campaign, has informed the president's thinking on everything from NAFTA to new lumber tariffs to potential trade restrictions on steel and aluminum. A former economics professor at the University of California, Irvine, who unsuccessfully ran for office 4 times, Navarro has a well-established reputation as an academic with hardline views on the threat that China poses to the U.S. He has since pulled the president so far right on trade that more moderate aides worry his proposals could launch a global trade war if Trump takes them too seriously, according to a dozen interviews with White House officials, close advisors, and Republican congressional aides. The president agrees with lots of Peter's writings on the effects of trade, said Steve Moore, a senior economist at the Conservative Heritage Foundation, who informally advised the Trump campaign on economic issues. So far, in a lot of ways, Navarro's opinion and views have really prevailed, especially with some of the saber-rattling on steel, aluminum, and lumber tariffs. Yet now, Navarro finds himself at a pivotal moment in his brief White House tenure. Trump and his team are in the throes of a wide-ranging debate on trade that could help define the president's approach to the issue for the rest of his time in office. How that shapes up will reveal as much about the president's policy leanings as it does about Navarro's effectiveness as a one-man, anti-China trade warrior, who sometimes finds himself aligned with Steve Bannon, the White House's chief strategist, and Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary. Navarro himself says that the president's trade agenda is already absolutely clear, even though trade experts say it's veered between more protectionist impulses and a global, free trade stance. In an interview in his office, Navarro said that the president began instituting that agenda by pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership shortly after the inauguration. TPP was the single most important action in the last 2 decades on trade, and the president did it on day 3, in that picture over there on the floor, with his complete advisor team united behind him, Navarro said, pointing to a photograph on his office floor. That was no easy lift. That agreement would have devastated what was left of our manufacturing and defense industrial base. White House aides said Navarro has clashed with most of Trump's senior staff at one time or another. Though he is often philosophically aligned with Bannon, and to a lesser extent Ross, aides said they have sometimes groused about his no-holds-barred tactics, which one aide compared to guerrilla warfare. But Navarro said he does not need to lurk around the West Wing to get an audience with the president. "I'm in the Oval only when called," he said. Trump gets advice on trade from an array of advisors with diverging views, including U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin, Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue and Labor Secretary Alexander Acosta. The advisors have been jockeying for influence for months, with Ross, Navarro and Lighthizer fighting to protect their central role in the process. Navarro's influence has dimmed a bit since the campaign, where he was often the only voice in the room on trade. Now, more than a dozen senior administration officials often attend the White House's regular trade meetings, which have been taking place behind the scenes for months, according to a senior administration official. Navarro works out of a large office filled with trade to-do lists down a long, quiet hallway in the Eisenhower Executive Office building, about half a city block from the Oval Office. Although he technically runs the National Trade Council and Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy, serving as a liaison between the White House and Commerce, he only has 2 staffers. One of them, Alexander Gray, worked on defense issues as a former member of the presidential transition team. In December 2016, Trump announced that Navarro would lead a new White House National Trade Council. A statement announcing the new council suggested it would have the same level of stature as other powerful policy offices in the White House like the Domestic Policy Council and National Economic Council. But the president later changed course, issuing an April executive order establishing the Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy, which is not an official policy council in the White House. The change was seen by some in the White House as a demotion for Navarro, though others said the trade office is meant to give Navarro a perch from which to exert influence. While the National Trade Council still exists, one White House aide said it's largely been folded into the Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy. Like any White House where real estate, resources, and staffers confer stature, two aides say Navarro's lean operation can hinder him, especially compared with the staffing might of the Domestic Policy Council or Gary Cohn's 30-person strong National Economic Council. His early days as a White House official were also bumpy, and were it not for his personal relationship with the president, other advisors likely would have sidelined him entirely. In one case, Navarro offended Republicans on the Senate Finance Committee when he met them to talk trade. In his presentation early this year, he lectured and talked down to the lawmakers without allowing for input or consultation, according to two congressional aides present in the meeting and an administration official briefed on it. I'm not sure if he was oblivious that many in the room voted for these trade agreements and therefore, completely disagreed with his entire premise, or if he fully understood that and didn't care, said one of the Republican congressional aides. Both his dictatorial style, as another aide called it, and the policy substance irritated members. Navarro also clashed early on with Kenneth Gister, the former deputy director of the National Economic Council under Cohn and deputy assistant to the president for international economic affairs. Their bickering, along with broader tensions between Gister and other members of the administration, contributed to the decision to nominate Gister as U.S. ambassador to India. Now Gister has been replaced on the NEC with another Cohn ally and former Senate Finance Committee staffer, Everett Disenstadt. He does not share Navarro's protectionist views but has much deeper relationships around Washington that should shield him politically, if Navarro tries to undermine him or they clash, according to one Republican trade expert. Navarro first entered into the Trump 2016 campaign vis-à-vis Jared Kushner, though he and Trump were familiar with one another's work dating back to 2011. As one of the only advisors on the campaign and transition with academic credentials, Navarro's experience helped him build clout in the White House, where aides value loyalty. But Navarro's policy stances have sometimes alienated him from other White House aides. He vigorously advocated for the president to pull out of NAFTA, the 1994 agreement that knocked down trade barriers between the United States, Mexico and Canada. Trump almost did until other White House advisors learned of the plan and enlisted foreign leaders, businesses, and senior lawmakers to lobby the president to remain in the agreement, arguing that leaving would hurt the economy and the supply chain. Instead, Trump said he would renegotiate NAFTA, a blow to Navarro's trade vision. Navarro says that Trump still has the option to pull out of NAFTA, if the U.S. Trade Representative cannot, in the end, negotiate a good deal for the country. More recently, Navarro has scored several policy wins. In late April, the administration announced that it planned to impose tariffs on softwood lumber imports from Canada. The United States and Canada have been feuding about softwood lumber for decades, and Trump's decision to hit Canada with tariffs infuriated the country's leaders. Navarro declined to comment on his role in it. Behind the scenes, Navarro has also been pushing for a 25% across-the-board tariff on steel imports from certain countries like China, according to two administration officials. Trade experts worry that such a dramatic move would upend global trade practices and cause countries to retaliate, potentially leading to a trade war. The steel tariff discussion that has pitted Navarro, Bannon, and Ross against a bevy of White House advisors including Cohn. The steel issue is not in any way about China per se. It is simply about the fact that our domestic steel mills are under sustained attack from imports from many different countries, raising the very real danger of losing additional steel mills and capacity that we need for our economic and national security needs, Navarro said. White House officials say the president is leaning toward a middle ground approach on steel imports, but they caution that a final decision hasn't been made. Yet this mixed record of success on trade and his reputation as the administration's nutty professor has not deterred Navarro. White House sources say Navarro is pushing nearly 24 different proposals on trade and manufacturing behind the scenes. And Navarro isn't afraid to name-drop the president or Ross in meetings to try to move along his agenda with lower-level staffers who may not completely understand the White House's hierarchy. I don't think there's anybody in the White House who pushes harder for things, who doesn't give up on any idea or draft policy even when faced with hurdles or daunting challenges, one administration official said. How the White House and Republicans underestimated Obamacare repeal. The longer Republican efforts to repeal Obamacare flounder, the clearer it becomes that President Donald Trump's team and many in Congress dramatically underestimated the challenge of rolling back former President Barack Obama's signature achievement. The Trump transition team and other Republican leaders presumed that Congress would scrap Obamacare by President's Day weekend in late February, according to 3 former Republican congressional aides and 2 current ones familiar with the administration's efforts. Republican leaders last fall planned a quick strike on the law in a series of meetings and phone calls, hoping to simply revive a 2015 repeal bill that Obama vetoed. Few in the administration or Republican leadership expected the effort to stretch into the summer months, with another delay announced this weekend, eating into valuable time for lawmakers to tackle tax reform, nominations or spending bills. As Trump himself infamously remarked, nobody knew healthcare could be so complicated, even though healthcare has reliably tripped up past administrations. Now that the difficulty of getting 50 senators to rally around a bill has come into stark relief, Republicans are starting to acknowledge they misjudged the situation. It's easier to rage against the machine when you're not in control of the machine, number one. And the perception that we're in control of the machine is inaccurate, said Senator Tim Scott, RS.C. Needing 50 out of 52 members on the same page in the Senate? I think that is not being in control of the machine. The failure of the plan to quickly repeal Obamacare earlier this year forced Republican leaders to start over and attempt the daunting task of crafting a more comprehensive health care plan that would unite all sides of a squabbling conference. And the Trump administration's lack of sufficient staff and planning for that early effort helped lay the groundwork for the legislative chaos the GOP's agenda is mired in today. A senior administration aide said that although the White House didn't expect health care to take so long, the blame game will dissipate if the president signs a health care bill by August. If, a week from now, we have completed the repeal of Obamacare, I don't think people looking back on it will do the woulda, coulda, shoulda game, the aide said. Still, rank-and-file senators now say starting with tax reform could have done more to unify the party and avoid the GOP's ongoing quagmire. I would have much preferred to start off with tax. But that wasn't my decision, said Senator David Perdue, R. Georgia. Tax is the heavy lift here. It's not going to be easier than health care. And we've been doing this for 7 months. Past administrations have also been hurt by health care. Democrats said after the passage of Obamacare that they wished they had delayed the topic until more of their agenda was underway. House Democrats lost their majority in 2010 shortly after the law passed. First Lady Hillary Clinton took flak in the early 1990s for her failed health care task force, and President George W. Bush faced tremendous opposition when his administration pushed through the Medicare Part 500 prescription drug benefit, even though the program has cost less than original estimates. Still, after the November 2016 election, few in Trump world or Congress saw potential problems after Republicans campaigned on killing off the Affordable Care Act for 7 years. We are probably all guilty of not being as creative as we needed to be, said one former congressional leadership aide. Every administration likes to check off an accomplishment. During the transition, the Trump administration never established a great deal of coordination with the Hill or a concrete game plan for health care, according to congressional aides and one former transition official. The transition had just a handful of health policy people, who are also tasked with working on the confirmation processes for Health and Human Services Secretary Tom Price and Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services Administrator Seema Verma. The administration official said the lengthy confirmation process, which he blamed on Democrats, hurt the White House because it meant the administration did not have two key health policy experts in place. Helping sort through the process were Mark Short, now the White House Legislative Affairs Director, Rick Dearborn, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff, and Stephen Miller, a senior advisor for policy. All three had congressional experience, but several Republicans said Trump's staff lacked experience negotiating or moving major legislation. "I just don't have confidence that the administration had the healthcare expertise and policy advice that they needed there," said G. William Hoagland, former staff director for the Senate Budget Committee and former leadership aide to Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist. "The result is what we are seeing today." On the Hill leading up to the inauguration, one leading idea was to resurrect the 2015 House and Senate bills that repealed much of the law. Republicans were already on the books supporting the bills, which needed only 50 votes in the Senate instead of 60. But when GOP leaders in January pitched the idea, which involved repealing the law and figuring out the replacement later, they were met with stern resistance from lawmakers worried about constituents who had gained insurance through the 2010 law and who could lose coverage if it were suddenly revoked. "Healthcare looks much easier when you're at the talking point level," said Larry Levitt, a senior vice president at the nonpartisan Kaiser Family Foundation and senior health policy advisor during the Clinton administration. "It always gets more difficult as you start filling in the details." This was the first hint of real trouble for the Republican health care efforts. Passing a bill they knew would be vetoed under Obama was easy, passing one that would thrust their constituents into uncertainty was riskier. When you're 6 years into a program, to change it when people are relying on it, there's a fear that it may affect their own policies or their own families, said Senator Jeff Flake, Arizona. "This is tough, this is complex. We knew it would be, but it's really tough." In late January, lawmakers at a closed-door session at a Republican retreat in Philadelphia raised a myriad of concerns about tackling Obamacare, from the contours of the replacement plan to ways to keep premiums affordable. One former Republican Senate aide later called that meeting with Andrew Bremberg, the head of the White House's Domestic Policy Council, prescient, because lawmakers privately raised many of the concerns that have since dogged the bill. At the same policy retreat, House Speaker Paul Ryan laid out a three-pronged approach to scrapping Obamacare. He wanted to repeal as much of the legislation as possible, eliminate more through deregulation, and then work with Democrats on a replacement, said one former Republican aide. Many Republican lawmakers doubted Democrats would work with them on redoing the healthcare law. The president and one of his former campaign rivals also unexpectedly helped undermine the GOP's repeal plans. Senator Rand Paul, RK, said on television the GOP needed a replacement plan if it was going to repeal the law. Then Trump endorsed that requirement. Their comments caused GOP leaders to start from scratch. Now that the Senate's attempt to revamp the healthcare law has run into roadblocks, with moderates insisting on protecting coverage for their constituents, while conservatives focus on undoing as much of Obamacare as possible, both Paul and Trump have suggested going back to a repeal-only bill. Many Republicans say that's unworkable now. "We're not just trying to get rid of the law, we're trying to replace it with something better. Getting rid of it is pretty straightforward," said Senator Marco Rubio, R. Florida. "Replacing it with something better is a significant undertaking, but it needs to be done." Now, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell maintains that the Senate will vote soon, though he was forced to delay again while Senator John McCain, R. Arizona, recuperates from surgery. With two Republicans saying they will definitely vote no, the bill could not pass without McCain present. Other senators are still undecided. They're trying to turn around a massive piece of public policy that has been the law of the land for 7 years, said Lanhee Chen, policy director for the 2012 Romney-Ryan presidential campaign. "One cannot overstate the magnitude of what is being attempted. This is a totally unique experiment in some ways. In the meantime, Neither the White House nor Congress wants to claim responsibility if it doesn't work out. While lawmakers grumble that Trump should have started with an easier policy goal, White House aides say they assumed congressional Republicans had it under control. Republicans had campaigned on undoing Obamacare since 2010, the senior administration official said. That was not contingent on President Trump. Trump repeats claim that most politicians would have attended Trump Jr. meeting. President Donald Trump claimed again on Monday that most politicians would have attended the highly scrutinized meeting his son had with a Kremlin-linked lawyer during the presidential campaign last year. As he said last week at a news conference in Paris, Trump said on Twitter on Monday morning that most politicians would have gone to a meeting like the one Don Jr. attended in order to get info on an opponent. That's politics. He wrote. The June 2016 meeting, which Donald Trump Jr. agreed to organize after he was told that a representative of the Russian government would provide the campaign with dirt on Hillary Clinton, has become a focal point of ongoing scrutiny into the president's campaign's relationship with Russia. Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor, Jared Kushner, and his then-campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, also attended. Trump Jr. insists that nothing substantive came of the meeting and has similarly defended it as an attempt to gather routine opposition research. The president has said he was not aware that it took place until very recently. A special counsel is probing whether any Trump associates participated in the Kremlin's efforts to interfere in the presidential election, including the cyber attacks targeting Democratic Party officials. The White House has repeatedly denied any improper conduct. Some critics of the president have likened the meeting to prove that the campaign was at least open to colluding with the Russians. After news reports detailed the meeting last week, Trump Jr. released an email chain showing that he had responded to the suggestion of a Kremlin-led effort to help his father's campaign by saying, "I love it." Opposition researchers from both parties have contested Trump's claim that such activity is common or accepted practice. Campaigns and political parties regularly seek out unflattering or compromising news stories about their opponents, but experts said last week that accepting help from an adversarial foreign government is rare and a cause for concern.